Hello, everybody. Welcome on this lovely Wednesday morning or afternoon. We'll give folks about a minute to trickle in and then we'll get started. All righty. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's webinar, Nuclear Energy in 2023, Where We Are and What's Ahead. My name is Sarah Viken, and I'm the Manager of Educational Programs here at ELI. We have a great program lined up for you today, exploring a variety of perspectives on the current state of nuclear energy and where the U.S. can go from here. I want to thank all of our wonderful speakers for lending us their expertise today and for taking the time to prepare content for all of us about such important issues. I also want to thank all of you, our audience, for tuning in. We always appreciate your interest in all of our topics, but especially this one. Today's program will feature commentaries from our wonderful panelists, as well as a roundtable discussion. We will be taking questions further along in the program, so please don't wait to submit them. You can use Zoom's Q&A function at any time throughout the webinar, and our moderator and speakers will be able to see it. We encourage you to use the chat for any observations, comments, and questions for your fellow audience, but please be aware that we will be pulling discussion questions from the Q&A box, so leave all questions for our speakers there. The webinar will be recorded and posted to the event webpage for ELI members to view later. So if you're an ELI member and you can't stay for the entire webinar today, the recording will be available within a few business days. You can find the recording, as well as more information on becoming a member, at eli.org. Before we get started, I want to introduce our moderator for the day. So there we go. Tara Righetti. Tara Righetti is the University of Wyoming Occidental Chair in Energy and Environmental Policy at the School of Energy Resources and the Hobbs School of Environment and Natural Resources, as well as a professor in the College of Law. She's the co-director of the Nuclear Energy Research Center and has served as a Fulbright Scholar in the 2021-2022 academic year at the Université de Lille in Lille, France. Prior to joining the University of Wyoming in 2014, she served in legal and executive roles in a privately owned upstream oil and gas company. Tara is a member of the state bars of Texas and California and is a certified professional landman and member of AAPL. She has served as a member of the U.S. Technical Advisory Group to ISO TC 265 carbon dioxide capture and transportation and geologic storage since July of 2022, and has chaired the Diversity and Inclusion Committee for the Foundation for Natural Resources and Energy Law this year. Thank you so much for moderating this conversation. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Tara.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah, for that introduction and for organizing this panel, as well as for the invitation to moderate such an incredible group of speakers who are with us today. I can't emphasize too much what an important time this panel comes at. During the last few years, we've seen increasing awareness of the critical role that nuclear energy will play in reaching decarbonization goals, both in the US and globally. And at the same time, Russia's war in Ukraine has made apparent the limitations and vulnerabilities of the current nuclear fuel cycle. And in response to these dual challenges, we've seen Congress enact new policies to encourage demonstration and development of advanced nuclear technologies and new facilities for enrichment of nuclear fuel, as well as encouraging the NRC to evaluate operations to streamline its licensing frameworks to be consistent with some of the safety improvements of advanced reactor technologies. I think together, all of these could mean a significant expansion of nuclear facilities, infrastructure, and even primary fuel production in the United States within the next several decades. And this could have important implications for the transition to low carbon energy. However, it also raises issues associated with justice. And I think a just approach to nuclear energy deployment in the United States will demand conscientious approaches to resolving potential environmental justice concerns with facility sightings, a focus on fair and engaged procedures, and restorative justice approaches to the legacy harms associated with past nuclear development in the United States. So through this panel, you're going to hear a group of fantastic speakers speak to what is needed and how the nuclear industry can meet these challenges and what we should be seeing ahead. I'm going to start with some introductions, and then I'll turn over the floor to our speakers. So our first speaker is Jeff Merrifield, who is a partner with Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw Pittman in Washington, D.C., where he leads the energy practice and focuses on advanced nuclear reactors, physical security at operating nuclear reactors, and counseling to executives and boards of directors. He's widely recognized as a leader in advanced nuclear and fusion deployment and has assisted large and developing nuclear utilities, suppliers, and governments in effectively meeting their regulatory requirements and strategic objectives regarding the deployment of complex energy systems. Jeffrey was appointed by President Clinton and reappointed by President Bush to serve as the commissioner of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission from 1998 to 2007. Prior to this, he spent nearly a decade serving as a policy advisory on energy and environmental matters for 2 members of the United States Senate, and was the staff director and counsel for a subcommittee of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. He also spent 7 years as the senior vice president of business development for the largest constructor of power plants in the U.S. Currently, he is chairman of E4 Carolines, the 150-member Energy Association of North and South Carolina, and serves on the boards of ClearPath and the United States Nuclear Industry Council. And he's previously served on the board of the U.S. Ecology Corporation. Our next presenter, Charlene Smith, is a senior nuclear energy analyst at the Breakthrough Institute in Washington, D.C. She specializes in regulatory analyses and public discourse on advanced nuclear technologies. She obtained her master's and PhD in nuclear engineering from the University of Florida and currently holds a courtesy faculty appointment as a nuclear materials research scientist at the University of Florida. Victor Ibarra is an analyst for the Nuclear Innovation Alliance, where he works on various nuclear innovation projects and leads research and advocacy related to state-level advanced reactor policy and legislation. Before joining NIA, Victor worked in radiation safety for the UT Health Science Center in Houston, Texas. He has also worked at NASA, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and the Comanche Peak Nuclear Power Plant. He has extensive experience in nuclear science and technology policy, having previously served as chair for the Texas Nuclear Engineering Student Delegation and as a delegate for the U.S. Nuclear Engineering Student Delegation. Victor received his BS in nuclear engineering from Texas A&M University and will complete his MS in engineering and public policy from Carnegie Mellon University in May of 2024. Christopher Shuey is an environmental health scientist and director of the Uranium Impact Assessment Program at Southwest Research and Information Center, a not-for-profit educational and scientific organization in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He has been on the SRIC staff for 42 years, working on the environmental and health impacts of uranium mining and processing in the Four Corners area, oil and gas development nationally, and groundwater protection policy at the local, state, and national levels. Chris is currently a co-investigator for 4 federally funded biomedical studies. He's also lead of the Community Engagement Core of the University of New Mexico Metals Superfund Research Center. He has served as an expert witness in state regulatory proceedings and has testified before Congress on 4 occasions. His work with Diné and Laguna communities has involved training citizens to assess local environmental impacts of uranium mining and processing on water and air quality, recruiting and training community members to serve as both researchers and study participants in biomedical investigations of population-based exposures, and applying results of public health research to federal proposals to remediate hundreds of abandoned mines. So I think, as you can see, we have an incredible list of speakers with a wide range of expertise on this subject. And so with those introductions completed, I will turn the panel and the floor over to you, Jeff.
Kara, thank you very much and appreciate that introduction and looking forward to this conversation we're going to have today. What I'm going to do in my presentation in about 7 to 10 minutes is really sort of lay the groundwork for the discussion we're going to have on what advanced reactors are and where they're headed. Before I do that, however, yeah, here we go. I want to just do a sort of level set on where we are with nuclear power today. Right now, is pictured here, there are about 420 nuclear power plants in 33 countries around the world. That represents about 10.5% of the world's total energy and about 35% of its carbon-free generation. So an important resource in that regard. Here in the States is about 20% of our electricity supply, but 45% of our carbon-free generation. So it is the single largest form of carbon-free energy that we have today. Lots of countries operate research reactors. More than 200 reactors power 160 ships and submarines worldwide, and the entirety of the U.S. Carrier and subfleet has a history dating back to the 1960s, powered by nuclear power. A lot of plants are under construction, around 54 of them in 17 countries, and there are a variety of countries considering embarking on these programs. When we talk about advanced reactors, there's various nomenclature that we use. And so I want to start with that first to provide a grounding for those of you who aren't as familiar with some of these terms and technologies. The first one is how we refer to them in size. More frequently, you're going to hear about microreactors. These are very small nuclear reactors, less than 20 megawatts. Some of these are being targeted by the U.S. military for potential military utilization. There are smaller scale reactors between 20 and 300 megawatts, and this will be the main part, I think, of what you're going to be seeing for advanced reactor deployments in the U.S. coming forward. And then larger scale reactors. All of the U.S. nuclear power plants currently operating are greater than 300 megawatts, and that's the 93 that we have operating today. One of the things I forgot to mention on the previous slide, but I think it is worth noting, not only do we have that sheer number of reactors, but they operate at about a 95% capacity factor. So they are the most reliable part of the U.S. electricity grid. You're also going to hear a term called small modular reactors. This refers to both their size and the fact that they are built in a more modular fashion, with many more of the components built in a factory-like setting. Many of the areas we'll discuss today have that feature. Now, all of the reactors that we currently have in the United States are what are called light water reactors. They use tap water for both cooling and moderation of those designs. And some of the ones that we'll talk about today fall into that category. Others, such as high temperature gas, liquid metal cooled, or molten salt, these are technologies that were developed by the United States, originally the Atomic Energy Commission, later the Department of Energy National Labs. And so there is a lot of history with these designs, but they were not widely deployed commercially. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that coming forward. Now, this chart, this next one, as soon as it pops up, is a discussion of a variety of the different representative designs that are out there right now. I'm not going to go through each and every one of these, and I would note there are other reactor designs which are being deployed that aren't on this list. For the sake of the discussion, we couldn't put 15 different designs up there. But these are some of the designs we're going to hear about in the news. Some such as NuScale and GE, which are smaller light water reactors that are being deployed. Utah, Ontario, Tennessee. Westinghouse recently came out with a design for a smaller version of a design that they've had built in both Georgia and China. And then Holtec, which is from New Jersey, which is looking at potential deployments in New Jersey and in Michigan. X-Energy has a plant that they are going to be deploying, or two plants, I should say, they're going to be deploying with Dow down in Texas. Tresor Energy has various operations up in Canada and is looking at using that for mining applications. TerraPower in Kemmerer, Wyoming. That's a company that's owned by Bill Gates. They were one of two recipients of an advanced reactor award from DOE I'll talk about in a minute. and then Oklo's Aurora and Kairos to round it out. So a lot of different technologies, a lot of different sizes, and it really opens up a wide variety of potential applications and utilizations. Now, the interest in reactors is different than it has been in the past. Today, all of the U.S. nuclear power plants are operated by utilities. What we're seeing today is some states which previously did not have nuclear reactors are thinking about deploying those, and those are listed there: Wyoming, Montana, West Virginia, and others. There's also interest by non-utilities in deploying these reactors for industrial purposes, namely Dow. In the facility I mentioned in Texas, Nucor is evaluating that for potential steel production, and both Microsoft and Google have announced that they too are evaluating the utilization of advanced reactor technologies to power the very large data farms that they have across the US. Now, there's a variety of federal incentives that have been placed there to really incentivize the deployment of these technologies. First one is there was money in the bipartisan infrastructure bill a while back that provided $2.5 billion that's funding what's called the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, which is the first deployment of a couple of technologies, namely X-energy and TerraPower. There was also $8 billion in funding for the deployment of various hydrogen hubs. That was recently announced by the Department of Energy. Two of the hubs will have a nuclear aspect to them, and I suspect we'll see more of that coming forward. Secondly, we have the Inflation Reduction Act. There were a variety of both production tax credits as well as investment tax credits that nuclear could apply for. One of them was obviously the first one. Currently existing nuclear power plants that expand through power uprates do qualify for those particular production tax credits. There are also investment tax credits available for new nuclear power plants that are produced. In addition, there is also a clean hydrogen credit program. Some questions about how that's going to be combined with some of those investment tax credits. And then there was also a large slug of money to incentivize the production of high-assay, low-enriched uranium. And I just note on that one for a second, the current fleet of nuclear power plants operate with uranium fuel enriched up to about 5%. It's just shy of 5% typically at the current fleet. Many of the advanced reactor technologies that we'll discuss do use higher enrichments of fuel. And so high assay low enriched uranium means uranium that can be enriched up to as much as 19.5%. We don't currently, we just started having the capability to do that on the civilian side in the US. That is an area where there will need to be some additional support and work to get the fuel necessary for these reactors, but I'll leave that one in the parking lot. There is also, I think, a lot of support overall for nuclear. The appropriation bills in 2023 and what we're seeing in 2024. 2023, we had about $1.47 billion for the Office of Nuclear Energy. Going forward, we're going to see somewhere between 1.56 and 1.78, I suspect, will go into FY 2024. The other thing I would mention here is there's something called the ADVANCE Act. That is a bipartisan bill by the chairman of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee and the ranking member, which looks to provide a variety of different reforms to try to enable the more speedy deployment and utilization of these technologies. Reduction in NRC licensing fees, reduction or elimination of the foreign ownership requirement, simplification of some of the brownfield redevelopment provisions, and then some other incentives in there to really enable deployment of these technologies. For its part, the House of Representatives, the Energy Committee, they had a recent markup at the subcommittee level of about 17 different pro-nuclear pieces of legislation. So I would anticipate there's certainly a potential that later this year, if Congress is able to get a few things together, there may be some nuclear legislation that may make its way up to the president. Finally, sorry, went too far here. Just to wrap it up, what is driving the deployment of these technologies? Well, first, I think there's a recognition that as we try to decarbonize our grid, having, reliable energy that can be dispatched, namely nuclear, needs to be a part of a holistic framework for providing carbon-free energy and can work very collaboratively both with wind and solar. Some of the ways in which that can be done, repowering of existing coal sites is something I think a number of these technology suppliers as well as utilities are looking at. New uses of nuclear power for industrial heat applications, desalination, water purification, hydrogen production, all of these are enabled by some of these advanced reactor technologies that have much higher temperatures, outlet temperatures, than the current fleet of light water reactors. And I think that's one of the reasons why Dow, among others, finds that to be quite interesting. They're smaller, they are more modular, so they're easier to deploy. They do have an increased, a lower accident risk because they have a variety of both active and passive safety features. The NRC will allow reduced emergency evacuation zones, and that's obviously something we could talk about more later. They are emission-free, and they do have the potential for load-following capabilities. So they are much more flexible than the current fleet. They're safer, and in many communities, states, and individuals that want to deploy these technologies are looking very seriously at them. And to answer what I think will be a question, I think we're going to start to see these deployed in the late 2020s, early 2030s. And with that, I turn it back to our moderator, Tara.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. And I think next up we have Charlene. So we'll go straight into that one. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. And thanks, Jeff, for your presentation. Jeff spent some time covering the nomenclature of nuclear technology, which is good. I think what I will be talking about here is, okay, we have these technologies. What does the legislative and the regulatory space or sphere look like? Jeff did cover a bit of what's going on in the legislative space. And I'll try not to belabor or repeat too many of the points he covered here, but these are some of the things that we are excited about, especially in the NGO space. So the current state of play in the legislative and the regulatory sphere, it reflects a step in the right direction. But of course, the legislative sphere and the regulatory sphere, they are moving at different paces. So to start with the legislative sphere, in recent years, the United States has seen significant development in the nuclear energy landscape. And as Jeff mentioned, one of the key milestones or key legislative efforts has been the Inflation Reduction Act, which aims to lower energy costs and to promote clean energy technologies, including nuclear energy. And what that means is that the IRA, it provides financial incentives, including loan guarantees, tax credits, and subsidies, all to support the development of advanced nuclear technologies. Also, as a part of the IRA, it includes building up or a high-assay low-enriched uranium availability in the United States, since that is primarily the fuel that most of the advanced reactors depend on to produce electricity. And the IRA also provides funding for infrastructure building at the Idaho National Laboratory to demonstrate advanced technologies. And so specifically, we're talking about the advanced test reactor and materials and fuels complex at the Idaho National Laboratory that are primarily working on advancing these technologies. Alongside the IRA, we have the ADVANCE Act, which Jeff also mentioned. And I think the ADVANCE Act is currently a pivotal piece of legislation that is designed to boost American nuclear leadership. And so some of the provisions generally in the ADVANCE Act, it empowers NRC to lead international efforts to reduce regulatory costs, to help to facilitate the development and the deployment of advanced reactors, as well as to preserve existing nuclear energy. And then on top of that, in parallel, you have the recently passed Fiscal Responsibility Act over the summer. And a part of that FRA, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, it came with changes to the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, that generally had 4 main changes to NEPA. One, you have to set the appropriate level of review for environmental reviews. You have to set page and timeline limits to your environmental reviews for different applications. And then finally, it included the consideration of the negative impact of a no action alternative. And so these are all things that for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is already under their jurisdiction as a part of the Atomic Energy Act. However, it's nice that it's iterated in these changes to NEPA. How and when the NRC implements these changes is really up to the NRC. But in a promising move from the NRC recently, in one of the advanced reactor stakeholder meetings, they had mentioned that they were putting together working groups to comply with the changes to NEPA in the Fiscal Responsibility Act. So there is something to be excited for there, but in summary, there is a lot of momentum in the legislative space. And there is some progress in the regulatory space as well, but there is a lot more room for the Regulatory Commission to gain as much momentum as there is in the legislative space. And I'm happy to continue the discussion on this in the Q&A later. Over to you, Tara.
Thank you. And now we'll turn over to Victor.
Thank you so much. Let me quickly share my screen and then I can get started. Can you confirm that you can see this?
Yes, looks good.
Perfect. Thank you. So thank you, Charlene, for handing it over, and thank you all for being here. Really excited to talk about what's going on at the state level of policy. Jeff, my colleague, gave you all a little bit of a taste of what's going on. And Charlene talked a little bit about federal legislation and how that's pushing other stuff to happen in the nuclear industry and field. And as a result, there's two things happening in parallel that I want to focus my 8-minute, 10-minute talking points about. One is what's really going on at the state of play for state policies, no pun intended. There are a lot of opportunities to encourage and enable advanced nuclear energy development. You're seeing states take a larger role in helping deploy new clean energy technologies that also include advanced nuclear. They can do that a variety of ways. Examples include passing legislation or even just introducing legislation related to technology inclusive clean energy standards, performing feasibility studies that can study whether or not advanced nuclear energy would be a good opportunity and option for a state and area. The creation of committees and working groups to really get stakeholder information and talk about what are some of the biggest barriers, but also what are the biggest opportunities that can come from potentially adopting advanced nuclear energy within your borders, and also labor and education programs. I really liked Tara's opening remarks because she highlighted the importance of trying to continue this movement in our energy transition in a just and sustainable manner. And a lot of that is going to be also from a socially sustainable manner when it comes to our labor capital. We are seeing, coal plant closures around the country. And we really want to make sure that if there's opportunity to either retrain folks or have retraining programs, there's coordination across local, state, and federal government to make sure that that's in play. So in 2023 alone, there's been a lot of encouraging signs about different states looking into nuclear, adopting pro-nuclear energy policies and passing key legislation to help spur nuclear energy deployment. And some examples include Kentucky, a historic state that has ties both with fossil fuel generation, but also has ties to nuclear energy as well. They were a site for the DOE gaseous diffusion plants and are interested in seeing how nuclear energy can potentially play out in their state, considering their circumstances of trying to manage how they're going to pursue a cleaner and more energy secure future. So just this year, they signed into law Senate Joint Resolution 79 that will create a permanent nuclear energy development organization. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying that we're seeing a lot of momentum for states to play a larger role in helping deploy new nuclear energy technology. But I will also say that there's also a lot of work still to be done. We saw a lot of encouraging movements in states like Illinois and North Carolina, where there was legislation to either overturn a moratorium in the Illinois case, or in North Carolina case, include nuclear fission and fusion technology in their definition of clean energy, which was a very timely thing to do, considering that they just recently passed a clean energy standard in 2021 on how to decarbonize their electricity grid. But that momentum was met by a veto from both their respective governors. So there's still a lot of work in education that we need to do in terms of talking to the appropriate stakeholders to educate them about what's going on in nuclear energy, what are the potential benefits associated with adopting new nuclear energy projects, and how can we fill in the deltas to make sure that we have this continued bipartisan support for nuclear energy, not just at the federal level, which we have seen a lot of in the past few years, but also continue this momentum at the state level. So the other thing that is happening in parallel is we have this really fun map on the Nuclear Innovation Alliance website. It's our technology deployment map, and it shows where a lot of advanced reactor projects are being either scheduled to be deployed in the coming years, or where they can potentially be deployed in the coming years, either through like a MOU or something along those lines. And this is a completely interactive map. So, you know, one of the policies that I pointed to on my last slide was that Governor Abbott, my governor, in the sense that I am from Texas, he signaled to the Public Utility Commission in Texas to create an advanced nuclear energy working group to see how advanced nuclear energy can play a role in meeting Texas's energy necessities. So if you use this handy map, you can see what kind of projects are going on. For example, we have Texas being a leader, as Jeff previously mentioned, by having an industrial company, Dow, try to deploy a high temperature gas reactor project at their industrial facilities in Seadrift, Texas. We also have another advanced reactor project, which is the Abilene Christian University trying to deploy molten salt reactor technology, and has already submitted a construction permit application to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for a test reactor facility on their university campus, which is really exciting news to hear. So these are just two examples that are going on in parallel of how different entities are taking a larger role in helping to deploy advanced nuclear energy technology. On this last slide, where I want to sum up some of my major thoughts, over the past 2 years, we've seen a lot of momentum, and I want to preface that this is a map that's technically under progress, and I would definitely encourage the folks attending this webinar to also fill out this map using other resources. NEI has a very good compendium of state legislation that they've accumulated over the past few years that have been basically summarizing all the nuclear energy inclusive policies and legislation that have passed over the last few years. But this map alone represents what has been going on the past few years. We see different states and different communities with different backgrounds really trying to look into nuclear and seeing if it's right for them. They are developing working groups. They are including nuclear energy, whether it's fission and fusion, in their clean energy standards, and they're trying to figure out if advanced nuclear energy can be part of their clean energy goal solution and their energy security solution moving forward. And there's a lot of exciting legislation that's being passed. One of my favorites that I like pointing to is in Colorado. They also just signed a bill this year that will perform a feasibility study that also takes into account the labor capital, so the people in the state of Colorado, and how they can take advantage of advanced nuclear reactor projects potentially going online in their backyard. And that's the focus of the feasibility study, which I think is very important and very timely if we want to make sure that advanced nuclear energy can become a reality as we move forward. And to close kind of my final thoughts, I really appreciate Jeff talking a little bit about what's going on with coal repowering, IRPs. As we see states pass clean energy standards, it forces utilities' hands to figure out, okay, you said we have to decarbonize by 2035, 2040, 2045, etc. How are we going to do that? So they do their modeling, they run their numbers. And if you look up different utilities integrated resource plans, for example, one that I point to is Duke's, Dominions, those are just a couple of examples. You can see different scenarios where they try to outline how they can achieve deep decarbonization. And by deep decarbonization, I mean, as close as they can in terms of zero, fully 100% decarbonized grid. And a lot of the results are saying that if we are going to fully decarbonize, we have to use some form of nuclear energy and have it integrated in their plans moving forward. So that's why a lot of states are looking forward in terms of trying to deploy advanced nuclear energy technologies. And that's why they're taking a larger role in trying to put themselves in a situation where they don't leave their communities behind, they don't leave their workers behind, and see if they can take advantage of the leading opportunities for deploying advanced nuclear energy technologies. With that, I'll turn it back to Tara. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victor, for a really interesting presentation. Now we're going to hear from Chris, who's going to talk to us more about the front end of the nuclear cycle and some of the environmental impacts from those activities.
Thank you, Tara. So Sarah or Tara, if you don't mind, I'll tell you to hit the next slide button because I need to have access to my notes here, if you don't mind. So my name's Chris Shuey, and I have worked at Southwest Research and Information Center in Albuquerque since 1981, 42 years. During that time, I've been largely working with indigenous communities in the Southwest on uranium mining and milling impacts. I chose this title, Uranium Doesn't Grow on Trees, the Impacts of the Front End of the Nuclear Fuel Cycle in Indigenous Communities, because sometimes when I listen to people talk about the impacts of uranium or not the impacts of uranium mining, it sounds like it's kind of a renewable resource or something, and that's not the case. So I'm going to, my purpose really today is to raise awareness about the front ends of the nuclear fuel cycle, to challenge some of the assumptions that nuclear power in totality is green and clean when every part of the nuclear fuel cycle except the reactors emit carbon. Next slide. Somebody wants to know if my words are garbled. Are we?
You sound great to me.
Okay. All right,
Yeah, sounds good for me too.
Good. Well, just a couple of acknowledgements. Our work is funded by both public and private resources. We owe a great deal of gratitude to the many community members here in the Southwest who have participated in our studies and who live on the front lines of these impacts from uranium mining that dates back into the 40s and 50s. We always acknowledge here in the Southwest when we conduct activities on lands that belong to indigenous peoples. And for the University of New Mexico that I work with and my office at Southwest Research, we're on the tribal homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia, and we want to maintain our commitment to working with indigenous peoples to protect that land base. Next slide. This is the big picture. Mining impacts indigenous people in the Western United States extensively. There's more than 161,000 abandoned hard rock mines. About 10,400 of them are abandoned uranium mines. In the Western United States, half of the U.S. Indigenous population lives, and we've calculated that over 600,000 Native Americans live within 10 kilometers of abandoned uranium mines. Now, uranium mines end up being the second largest category of abandoned mines in the West, next to only gold. But we're concerned and have been concerned about the chronic exposures of Native people. They rely upon local resources. Generally, their health status is underdescribed. And importantly, our neighbors on Navajo, Laguna, and other places out here, they're tied to the land. They don't move. So when we talk about reducing exposures, often it's moving people away from exposures. In this case, we've been trying to figure out how to move uranium waste away from people. Next slide. This is just a huge map that shows the distribution of abandoned mines on the Navajo Nation. People, according to EPA, people live within a quarter mile of 14% of these 524 AUMs, and that's really a fraction. There's a lot more mine sites out there, including 1,100 mining features or places that maybe ore was dumped one day and 3 weeks later was transported to another site and dumped. So we have a major source. These are major sources of exposure to all the people who live around these sites, and it goes from east to west and north to south throughout the Navajo Nation. Next slide. We've made very little progress in addressing the cleanup, the remediation of abandoned mines. According to EPA's 10-year plan for the Navajo Nation that was issued in January 2021, they haven't fully remediated a single AUM. There's a whole range of abandoned mine sites that have gotten removal site evaluations, are moving into the ECAs, the engineering evaluation and cost analyses. EPA says it has $1.7 billion, but that's good enough only for addressing about 40% of the AUMs just on Navajo. This despite congressional hearings in 79, 93, and 2007. And it's important to note that more than half of the Navajo communities, called chapters, have anywhere from 1 to 3 of the major uranium exposure sources: abandoned mines, contaminated water sources, or contaminated structures. Next slide. I'll go to the next slide, because I have to speed up this. It's important to note that there's common characteristics of these AUM sites, these abandoned mine sites, and their impacts on Native communities. These we highlight here just 4 communities, from the Pueblo of Laguna and the Jackpile mine just west of Albuquerque, through the Redwater Pond Road area in the Church. What we find is that metals, arsenic, in addition to, of course, uranium, arsenic, cobalt, molybdenum, selenium, all these various metals are in high concentrations in these wastes, and communities, because of the slow process of cleanup, have had to resort to their own collaborations with researchers and other community members to be trained in citizen science to do their own assessments. Next slide. I use this graphic from the NRC here to show you the front end of the nuclear fuel cycle, which is mining and processing. We also call it milling. And indeed, uranium does not grow on trees. It's a finite resource. As a naturally occurring metal and radioactive element, it has roughly a 2.5 part per million average concentration in the Earth's crust. It's what people do to it in bringing it out of the ground that creates the problem. A lot of our Dene, Navajo medicine people talk about how uranium is in Mother Earth as a protection, but that when it's brought out, it's like the proverbial horse out of the barn. It's hard to put it back in. Chemically, uranium is easily oxidized and exposed to air. it's ubiquitous once it's mined and released. And it's important to note that the government was the only purchaser of uranium between 49 and 71. There were production incentives in the 50s and through 65. And as I previously alluded to, mining, milling, conversion, enrichment, fuel fabrication, and waste transportation are all carbon emitters. The reactors are the only ones that don't, the only part of the fuel cycle that doesn't emit carbon. Next slide. Since this is a Environmental Law Institute proceeding here, I thought it was important to give a quick overview of the regulatory process for remediation of abandoned uranium mines. Keep in mind that back in 60 and 61, the old Atomic Energy Commission declined to regulate conventional uranium mining, meaning underground and open pit mining. Congress gave authority to the NRC to regulate uranium milling in 78, along with giving a DOE authority to clean up the so-called inactive or abandoned uranium mill sites that had pretty much stopped production by 1968. States have stepped into that and void. There are a few national priority list sites under CERCLA, but most of the abandoned uranium mines are being addressed under the time critical and non-time critical elements of the Superfund laws, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. And one of the reasons that this process is taking so long is that each site gets a CERCLA process. Recently, EPA has moved to consider consolidation of certain mine sites, but even then, it's a slow regulatory process. An RSE is 500 pages. A ECA is 500 pages. It's really difficult to keep track of this, the progress of trying to clean up. And at the same time, the disposal options, cap in place, consolidating waste, offsite removal, are controversial subjects out here. There's a lack of regional disposal facilities, and there is concerns about transportation of waste. This is a graphic of the CERCLA's response process here with the disposal options identified, but later on, unlike a RIFS for an NPL site, you don't get a record of decision, you get an action memorandum, and that's what we've been dealing with now for several years. Next slide. And I'll just quickly end because I'm over time. We have discovered multi-generational chronic exposures living next to these closed abandoned mines. We have documented extensive health impacts associated with these exposures and proximity to mines. How close you live ends up being one of the most significant predictors of chronic metabolic diseases in these populations. And these pictures are designed, and maps are designed to show you just how close people still live to these mine sites, and how in some areas, say in Cameron, Arizona, on the right lower side of the slide, there are 35 mines within 7 miles of the town. And this has been going on since the 1940s and the 1950s. The government has never taken responsibility for the cleanup of these sites. And so the work has really fallen to EPA settlements through the Tronox bankruptcy and settlements with mining companies to get these places cleaned up. So I'll end there. Thanks for the opportunity to speak and address all of you today. Yeah.
All right, thank you all for such fantastic presentations, and I really appreciate everybody's remarks and the wide range of topics that were covered. We have a range of questions from the Q&A, as well as I have a list of my own questions that could probably keep us going for an hour. So I'll try to move through these quickly so we can touch on a lot of different topics. I wanted to start by asking, and this is something that came up in our earlier discussion about what's going on internationally. The G7 Energy and Environment Ministers communication in April of 2023 discusses creating a working group to support cooperation around nuclear energy. So what is the role of nuclear in the United States efforts to build capacity and support decarbonization abroad? And that's to anyone who wants it.
Well, let me go to the first part of your question. I mean, if you do sort of around the world, a very active country right now is Canada. You know, they have 18 or 19 operating nuclear power plants. They made a decision to extend the life of those plants, and they have a variety of projects all the way from the east in New Brunswick. They're evaluating a couple of reactor technologies. Ontario Power Generation, the largest utility in Canada, is going to be deploying 2 to 4 advanced reactors, and they've selected GE for their technology. Others, Bruce Power, also in Ontario, Sask Power in Saskatchewan, and the folks in Alberta are also similarly looking at deploying reactors down the road. So a lot going on in Canada as part of their decarbonization effort. In Europe, I think the events in Ukraine really triggered a number of the Eastern European countries that had used Russia as a supplier to reevaluate that. And so a number of them, including Ukraine, Slovakia, Czech Republic, are using Western sources, namely Westinghouse, to provide their fuel supply. Many of those very same countries, and then I'd also include Bulgaria as well, have indicated they want to build additional nuclear generation to avoid and to basically replace natural gas production that they use from Russia. One interesting entrant in Europe is Poland. Not only have they indicated they're going to build some of the large Westinghouse nuclear power plants, but one of their steel suppliers has committed to as many as 10 small modular reactors from GE. So a lot of activity in Eastern Europe, even in Western Europe, Sweden. A recent announcement, Norway is looking at nuclear, and they did not have an operating power plant. Netherlands has put it back on the plan, and Belgium, which was going to shut down its units, actually has decided to extend the life of those units and may well consider additional new ones. So a lot going on in Europe. In Africa, Ghana has indicated its desire to move forward, and I think we're seeing a number of countries in Asia, including the Philippines and Singapore, potentially Indonesia, looking at these technologies as well. So a lot of interest across the board.
Another sort of general question is that all of your presentations either focused on the front end of the fuel cycle or on generation. But one theme that I see in the Q&A is what about the back end? What progress has been made regarding either spent fuel reprocessing or long-term storage solutions?
Happy to take that. Do you want to take a first crack?
Yeah, I can take a first crack, Jeff, and then anyone else feel free to hop in. So I will say that in this current cohort of advanced nuclear energy technologies, we are exploring the opportunities to take advantage of recycling or reprocessing technology. There are federal programs, including under DOE ARPA-E, to explore trying to reduce the technology risk and reduce the economical costs associated with reprocessing technology. And there are advanced reactor companies that have publicly announced that their business model is currently based off trying to take advantage of recycled or reprocessed technology. A good example that we can point to is an advanced reactor company called Oklo. They have recently announced a couple of deployment sites across the United States. They are going to be providing clean energy to the Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska under a DoD SCO sponsored project. And also they will be deploying a couple of their Aurora reactors in the Piketon, Ohio Sodai redevelopment area, which is really interesting because it's trying to redevelop previously DOE owned land and trying to repurpose it for advanced nuclear energy projects. So anyone else, feel free to hop in.
Yeah, I'll jump in for a second. There isn't a single one of these presentations that one of the first questions, isn't raised about what about the waste. And as a former regulator, I've got a few positions on that. First one is, used nuclear fuel is the most heavily regulated metal in the world, and not a single individual has been killed or injured, seriously injured as a result of its storage. So it is stored very safely. In the United States, if we took every used nuclear assembly and put it in one place, you could fit it in a soccer stadium. Or if you had it in canisters, you could fit it in a Walmart distribution center. So we're not talking about vast amounts of material, but it's extraordinarily large in terms of its ability to provide power and heat. I would also say, probably controversially with some, I was on the NRC when we were in the midst of evaluating the safety of the Yucca Mountain site before Senator Reid cut the funding and disallowed that program from moving forward. The NRC staff was on a path to declare that would be a safe facility for storing that waste. Now, looking forward, where are we? What we're going to see in the next several years is Finland will be moving forward with a used fuel permanent repository, and I think that will certainly answer a number of questions of folks about the ability to successfully put one of these forward. And I think we have generally a very safe methodology here in the United States for storing that fuel. We need to provide more options. I'm very excited about one called deep isolation, which is an potential in situ capability for very deep disposal of that material using some of the same technologies that we use for enhanced oil recovery and for deep shale gas. So I think there are a lot of options out there, and Victor, I think, quite rightly talked about reprocessing as well.
Yeah, I'd like to second both those statements, and just to add on that there is a provision in the ADVANCE Act that is currently a part of the NDAA where there is the provision is to compare the costs of the current approach to spent fuel, which is interim storage, to the cost of reprocessing or permanent storage. So that is a provision in the ADVANCE Act. I know it doesn't seem like much, but at least then that is something that would objectively, quantitatively come out of, okay, well, what's the most cost-effective avenue to approach spent nuclear fuel, whether it's to continue doing what we're doing now, or to reprocess it, or to put it in permanent storage. So there is some headway, no matter how small, that is happening in that space currently in the ADVANCE Act.
Well, Chair, I should weigh in here, I suppose. We live in New Mexico, which was the host to the Manhattan Project. We saw the Trinity blast go off in 1945. We saw the results of that work decimate Hiroshima and Nagasaki later that year. Uranium mining and processing has affected largely people of color in this state. And then on top of that, we have the Waste Isolation Pilot Project, which is the transuranic waste disposal site down near Carlsbad, New Mexico, in the southeast corner. Recently, and of course, the WIPP site has had its own series of mishaps over time. Recently, an NRC did license the Holtec storage facility down by Eunice, but the state has adopted legislation to oppose that. And you don't find many people along the transportation routes for spent fuel that are welcoming this. So I think that part of nuclear policy has to seriously consider the the other points of view that places like our state have paid a price for nuclear development, and the justice that Tara talked about earlier at the beginning has just not been received. And so there's while I'm not sure that reprocessing is an answer either. I was over in Japan about 12 years ago and learned a lot about why they stopped doing that after the Manju breeder reactor went down and then Fukushima happened. So there's just a lot of momentum in the opposite direction because of this legacy of impact.
Now, there's a lot there to unpack in Chris's comments. You know, from my standpoint, and I used to be a council on the Senate Environment Public Works Committee, and know of what you talk about on the native Navajo lands. It is very clear in our pursuit of a nuclear weapons program that there were mining practices and activities that did not meet the standards we have today and are seriously impacting individuals in those communities. And I think we do as a country, have a service to try to address those issues. So I agree with that essence. In fact, I've got a company I'm working with right now that's trying to develop a technology that could be deployed on the Navajo lands to address some of that in an environmentally sensitive way. I think, but there is a difference between the Trinity site and Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the civilian operation of nuclear power plants. And I think sometimes those get conflated, and I just want to make sure we're talking about apples and apples and oranges and oranges. The Atomic Energy Commission, the predecessor of the commission I worked on, had a much different mandate. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, has a mission of trying to do what's appropriate for public health and safety and protecting people and the environment. And I think it does a good job overall. I have some things I don't necessarily agree with it these days, but I think they do a good job, and they are really trying to address those issues for those communities. I would also want to just note there were some issues at WIB, but that generally has operated well in the mission that it was intended for, which was to address the disposal of transuranic waste and address a legacy issue. If we're going to get rid of legacy issues, we got to have someplace to put it. And New Mexico was selected because of the geologic formation that was there with the salt deposits. So I think there's a lot there to talk about. But I just want to make a couple of comments.
So building off that, I think one of the questions I see in our Q&A and is important to address is that an expansion of nuclear generation is going to mean an expansion of fuel production activities, most likely, whether that happens in the US or if it happens abroad. What frameworks or procedures or institutions are in place today that weren't in place when these legacy sites were developed to prevent some of these negative externalities? Or if they're not in place, what would need to be in place to make sure that if mining operations expand or resume here or abroad, that these environmental impacts on adjacent communities are being appropriately managed?
That's a great question, and I wish I could give you a good answer there. I honestly don't have a lot of familiarity with previous standards. I know in the NGO space, there have been floating discussions about how do we adequately try to include any in this scenario where we primarily use uranium as the fuel for nuclear fission reactors, about implementing standards that would appropriately try to avoid some of the consequences of the past and sustainably mine this fuel source so we can use it in different applications in the advanced nuclear energy arena. But that is something that is a little bit slow right now, and that NIA is trying to familiarize itself with more.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit, the different steps are a little bit complicated. I mean, obviously, and Chris talked a little bit about open pit mining, and there are different state, and I'm no expert on open pit mining, different state authorities that have supervision of that, as well as overlapping federal responsibilities. Where I did have some involvement as a former regulator was in situ leach mining. That does occur in parts of Wyoming, Texas, Nebraska. Those facilities have been some of them have been overseen by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Others have been overseen by the states. They are a different set of technologies from the open pit mining that caused a lot of the issues out west. And there needs to be attention to making sure those are appropriately remediated after the mining is complete. But that does not represent the same types of risk because of the way it is instituted. You're basically pumping in a material to leach out the uranium, and the rest of the rock material stays in place. Now, the fact of the matter is, from a mining standpoint, we don't mine a lot of uranium the way we used to. A vast majority of the uranium we're using in the United States right now comes from Canada, which is a major source, Australia, which is a major source, and Kazakhstan. Those are among the three largest sources. So they're not going to have the same kind of impacts. Now, where we are going to see, I think, a lot more activity is enrichment. We used to be the largest enricher of uranium in the world. That was done in Ohio and in Kentucky. We shut those down during the Clinton administration. We do have one operating uranium enrichment facility, LES, which is in New Mexico, that is operated by Urenco. It was permitted by the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and is operated safely and effectively since it went into operation, whatever it was, 8 or 10 years ago. There are additional facilities that are in the midst of being evaluated and built. Centrus, which is a U.S. company, recently made its first shipment of high assay, low enriched uranium into the system, and that production is coming out of, I believe it's Ohio. And there are also several companies that are evaluating using laser technologies for enriching uranium. One of those, GLE Silex, is based in Wilmington, North Carolina. So there's a lot of different technologies that are being evaluated, and those are technologies that would be appropriately overseen by the U.S. NRC with a modern set of regulatory standards.
I could add to that, Tara, that EPA has been sitting on a final rule for groundwater protection and in situ leach operations, and it hasn't promulgated it yet. That was one of the contentions in the case involving the Hydro Resources, Uranium Resources, ISL proposal for Church Rock and Crown Point, New Mexico on the Navajo Nation. And while NRC ended up issuing the license for that in 98, we were involved in administrative litigation before the commission. And I think that Jeffrey was probably a member of the commission at that time. And so that while it has a license, it is never operated. It is never taken a pound of uranium out of the ground. In this area, as in Wyoming and other places in the West, people are concerned about groundwater quality. Most of the state of New Mexico gets its drinking water from groundwater. The in situ leach industry has had a difficult time restoring aquifers to their pre-mining conditions once they inject lixiviant, whether that's just oxygen fortified water or some other mixtures. They have not been able to demonstrate a consistent compliance with pre-operational standards. People will say, well, there's in situ leach operations in Texas that have been certified as reclaimed or restored after the state relaxed the regulations, the standards. So there's the sensitivity out here is that the industry has not demonstrated its ability to comply and to be good neighbors, like folks have talked about here. And so you run up against a perception of that this is just not right. And I think a lot of people in the state of New Mexico feel like they'd already contributed to the national nuclear response, from weapons production to waste disposal and everything in between, and that it's time for others to take responsibility.
So sort of switching on to the question of the impact of nuclear generation on utility rates. An expansion of nuclear generation, and I think the International Energy Association has forecasted that we would see a doubling of nuclear power generation over the next 15 or so years. How would you expect this to impact electricity and utility rates, and how does this compare to our other available alternatives for either zero carbon baseload power or energy storage options? And I guess what considerations will be important as these questions are looked at by public service commissions?
Let me jump in with a couple of thoughts. So, one of the difficulties in evaluating different technologies is their duration, location, and ease to market. So, a lot of folks will say, well, if you look at LCOE for levelized cost of electricity for wind and solar, they appear to be a lot better than nuclear. One of the challenges with that, however, is it is a bit of an apples and orange comparison, and I would say that in a couple of respects. First, a nuclear power plant can operate, 80 plus years. Typical solar and wind assets are going to be operating for about 20 years until you're going to have to either repower them or replace them. A nuclear power plant operates 24/7 and showing the capacity factors we've had in the US 95% of the time. Wind and solar assets, together are operating around 30% of the time, roughly at best. And you've got to back them up either with natural gas, or you've got to have some other form of long duration storage if you're going to use those as dispatchable assets. The other issue is proximity and the space. We think about the environmental consequences of different technologies. One of the beneficial aspects of nuclear power is it's dense. You can site a lot of power in a fairly compact area, vice other renewable assets, which can take sometimes very large land masses. Where that gets complicated is we are increasingly losing areas that are most easily accessible, particularly with wind. And so we've either got to go to offshore applications, many of which have been canceled recently, by the way, or you've got to build in large transmission lines in order to be able to site those. And the fact is, people accuse nuclear of taking a while to build and not being fast enough. Many of you on the line have had to deal with the siting of transmission lines and the cost and expense and timeline necessary to make those work. So, there are ups and downs with all of these. I don't disparage wind and solar because I think they're a vitally important part of a total energy system. It's just we can't put all of our eggs in one basket. Similarly, we can't, we're not going to do 100% nuclear either, but it's going to be a mix. And I think nuclear has proven that it can provide reliable, safe, clean energy to our energy system, and I think it can do so even more going forward.
Thank you for those comments, Jeff. Just to add a little bit more color, I just want to talk about the flexibility of advanced nuclear energy projects. When we talk about decarbonizing our electricity grid, there are different players that demand that energy. Residential homes, university campuses, consider I'm a graduate student now, and also industrial users as well, right? So that's why industrial companies like Dow, Nucor are really expressing their interest in the next generation of nuclear reactors, because they'll be able to provide kind of that flexibility in terms of operating temperatures to really help decarbonize some of their industrial processes, which may be a little bit more difficult from other existing energy sources, like renewable energy, for example, right? So that's why a lot of folks are looking at it, and that's why there's growing interest from industrial companies and even technology companies that may want that firm, reliable power that can really achieve, 99.9999% reliability if you back it up with, a reactor or two in the scenario.
Yeah, I think I'll just kind of reiterate and add just a small analogy for what Victor and Jeff mentioned. So in terms of cost, I like to use the analogy where if you try to go to buy a vehicle and you have the option of buying a luxury vehicle or a reliable vehicle, okay, you have the two options. You have to look at over the course of the lifetime of those vehicles. If you need to do maintenance, if you get into an accident or you need to change parts, what the cost is going to be along the way to be able to do that. And looking at the whole profile of the lifetime of how long you have the vehicle and upfront costs that you pay for the vehicle, as well as maintenance costs. When you compare those two, looking at renewables versus nuclear, you have a more reliable option going with nuclear. Yes, the cost is huge, is large upfront, but when you talk about over the course of a period of time, it really ends up leveling out to a point where it comes to being competitive with solar and wind. And on top of that, it also offers the advantage of, going back to the capacity factor that Jeff mentioned. It's like if you have a vehicle and every time you go to turn the keys, if it's, you're running on renewables, it's the car turns on 1 in 3 times, versus if you have a nuclear power plant that's powering let's say powering the vehicle. In this analogy, 9 out of 10 times the car is going to turn on. And so it's a matter of balance and mixing. So if you have a renewable version, right, and you have a nuclear version here, if you turn the keys over, turn the car over, and it doesn't turn on, then you also have an option to jump to another energy source that is a bit more reliable. And so it is about balance. We're not saying that to fully decarbonize, you need to pick one energy source or the other. It really depends on what the demand and the capacity is in a specific area. But in the case of nuclear, a nice blend of renewables and nuclear energy as clean energy sources, from a cost perspective, it does level out over a period of time. So what you're looking at is, do you want to pay a lot of money now and then have reliability over a period of time, or pay a little bit of money now, invest a small amount, and then you don't really have a long-term investment that you can look forward to.
Charlene, I'm really glad you brought up this question of sort of non-utility, consumer power generation uses of advanced reactors. And, we're seeing some announcements around the potential for using advanced nuclear as part of industrial decarbonization. And that includes recent support for an assessment project in my home state of Wyoming. So one of the questions that I have is, if I was representing an industrial client, whether someone in manufacturing or chemical production or mining, and they were interested in assessing opportunities to use an advanced reactor, what are the initial questions that they should be asking in terms of assessing both the regulatory pathways and the viability of maybe transitioning from their existing sources of heat and power?
A very interesting question for maybe a commissioner or former commissioner.
Well, I mean,
We
I
can
mean, I
add,
think this.
no worries, Jeff.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things here. I mean, let's step back for a second. Why are industrial companies thinking about using these advanced reactor technologies for these industrial processes? And the answer is twofold. Number one, they know they have to decarbonize, and they need large, reliable 24/7 heat. Right? They can't rely on a resource that is intermittent or uses battery backups. When you're talking about industrial processes that need temperatures in excess of 1,000 degrees Celsius. And so one of the things that some of these advanced reactor technologies, including high temperature gas and molten salt, bring with it, liquid metal as well, is you can have outlet temperatures that are 700 to 900 degrees Celsius. What that allows you to do is use it both for power production purposes, but more importantly for decarbonizing other hard to decarbonize industrial very big heat users. So that's why Dow and other parts of the chemical industry are thinking about this. Now, the question as a former regulator is how do you do that in a manner that's going to protect public health and safety and not increase risk? And I think the answer is you can get there. We do have an example in Louisiana, the River Bend site, where you have a nuclear power plant in relative close proximity to a chemical plant. Frankly, in many regards, given how well the U.S. nuclear fleet has operated over the last 30 years, and compare that to the operations of the chemical plant, I'd be a lot more concerned about making sure that the nuclear power plant had the appropriate control and habitability and ability to operate that plant in the event of a chemical spill than I would be about the nuclear power plant impacting the chemical facility. But nonetheless, the NRC is going to have to do an analysis and make a determination, in what proximity would you be able to locate that plant? How do you do it in a manner that's going to be safe and protect people and the environment?
It looks like we may have lost Charlene. Oh, nope, you're back. Okay. The other question I sort of had is, as we see more and more project announcements for these advanced reactors, we've seen some announcements about the Eielson project, among the TerraPower project, which is in Wyoming, where I live. What are the most effective ways that communities and member of the public can engage in the public hearings and other engagement and outreach processes? So, having been both on the commission side and working with various project developers, where can you turn to good information? When is the most appropriate and effective time to start participating in those proceedings? Any sort of thoughts along those lines?
Well,
Yeah.
I think yeah, I mean, Tara, do you want me to take that first? I don't want to. If Victor wants to take that question, more than happy to have him take it.
You can take it after I just had some initial thoughts. So what I really just want to communicate is that this is a very sensitive topic and issue. We saw Dominion Energy perform a siting, a very I would say small in the sense that they didn't pour too many resources into it, siting study for advanced nuclear energy projects in Virginia. And I believe it was about 2 weeks ago, there was also a news article that came out where communities that had been identified in the feasibility study for these advanced nuclear energy projects in Virginia were quite upset that they hadn't been involved per se in the feasibility study survey. I think it's a very complicated topic and issue that we have to consider moving forward, because I think the pacing at which you engage future communities that may be interested in hosting new nuclear projects varies between, they want to be involved as early as possible versus they maybe want to be reached out to whenever a company maybe has a near or finalized design for their advanced nuclear energy project. So it really depends on, which community you're engaging, what their background is, what their history is and exposure is to nuclear. And there are different resources that they can take advantage of. I think considering the topics that we've discussed on this webinar, especially the sustainability and the justice angle of it as well, I would really want to point out some of the work that the Good Energy Collective does. They're a nonprofit, and they are trying to work on the sustainability and justice angle for nuclear energy, because they really do believe that we need nuclear energy in the future to reach our deep decarbonization and energy security goals. But if we need to do that, we need to make sure that we have these conversations that we've been having today and make sure that we empower our communities the best we can to make sure that they are making informed decisions about whether or not they want to move forward with their project or not.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I think the other thing too, it is very much regionally differentiated. I mean, when I left the commission, I moved to North Carolina, and I live within a 10-mile, I live in a 10-mile emergency planning zone of 2 nuclear power plants. And I attended the yearly meeting of the NRC with the public to talk about what was going on at the plant. And I showed up with 2 Boy Scouts and their Boy Scout leader because they were getting merit badges. There are other parts of this country, a similar meeting like that would have, several hundred people show up, a number of whom had real concerns. So it does vary a lot. I think the developers, I think the utilities, I think the companies that would like to deploy these plants should engage actively with the public in dialogue. It's to their best interest to try to educate the public, to let them know what they're doing, and do it as soon as they can. If they really think about building nuclear power plants, in their benefit to engage. There are different groups of people. There's a lot of people who don't have a problem with nuclear power plant. There are people who do, and there are different avenues for each. But I think education, providing information, being straightforward is an important element to doing it. There are processes that the NRC does have for folks to intervene if they oppose those nuclear power plants, and that is a well-trod process that I've been involved with both as a commissioner and our law firm, obviously is involved with those as well. One thing I've been seeing a lot of comments on the screen. I want to make one notion about a comment that got asked and not answered, and that is the total overall life cycle impacts of nuclear power on green energy. And this is something that's wielded against nuclear power, but it's not wielded against other technologies, wind and solar. The fact of the matter is the overall green input of nuclear power is very, very good when compared with other technologies. Yes, there is uranium mining that goes on. As I say, a lot of it these days is in situ or otherwise. But that's no different than the mining is necessary to put together a lot of the materials that go into other technologies, including lithium batteries, which use large-scale mining to provide those power sources as well. So to give an answer there, nuclear can scale up. We have, as I mentioned, 20% of our power is provided by nuclear. Most of that was built in a relatively short period of time, 10 or 15 years. I think we've got some capability doing that going forward. Nuclear, a lot of people wanted to be part of the mix, and I think it will be.
I just want to add just a bit on that. Like I agree with what you said, Jeff, and about specifically the developers and the utilities having a responsibility to engage directly with the public. But I will say, if you're a member of the public and you are motivated, then you can probably, in order to be a part of these discussions or figure out what's going on in the space, whether or not there is some development happening in or around your community, that you can just attend the NRC public meetings. If you go to the NRC public meetings website, you can kind of like survey exactly what is being discussed as it pertains to any developments that are being planned in your neck of the woods, and kind of you can ask, pose questions to the NRC and submit comments, and be able to directly engage with the regulator to provide your own input on what is going on in your area as far as applications that apply to building a reactor in your area.
So in our last 2 minutes, I just want to quickly go around the table and ask everybody sort of the same question. In your opinion, and just a couple, sentences each, so we don't go over, what are the most sort of important policy or regulatory innovations that we could see right now to help move the advanced reactor space forward and meet some of these goals as to our clean energy and appropriate safety, security, and safeguards? Why don't we start? We'll go in backwards order. So Chris, why don't you start, and then we'll do Victor, Charlene, and Jeff.
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that, because again, the perspective that we have out here is that nuclear power is not the answer. And I put into the chat or the question and answer a link to a series of presentations at the City of Eugene in February of 2022. You can find it on YouTube, and 4 speakers were addressing the same issues that you guys have been addressing today with small modular reactors and all that. And the cost advantages, they represented were not there. And they also asserted that development of these alternative nuclear power applications could delay full deployment of actual renewable resources, which is going on all over the place, especially out here. So I would say that that's an important part of the discussion that we don't hear about. And I also want to repeat that, our society needs to make a decision to make right what has happened in the past that is still affecting people today out here.
Thank you for those comments, Chris. I think, at least from my perspective, there needs to be a lot of coordination moving forward on how to potentially deploy advanced nuclear reactor technologies. And I say that from the sense of regional or RTOs. I think it's very important that there is conversations that are had right now, either in MISO or PJM, where I am in Pennsylvania right now, to talk about what's going to be happening in the future, especially because there's already queue for energy projects moving forward. And if we really care about decarbonizing our grid and our energy security goals, we need to make sure that we deploy just all technologies without sacrificing safety. So it's very important that this coordination goes on at this level to make sure that, transmission lines can be built and that the permitting associated with that is also addressed. So I think those are kind of very critical conversations that have to be had, but and also taking into account the social economical factors that are also have very equal weight of importance when we're talking about, meeting our energy security and climate goals as well.
So I'll jump on here. I know we're already over time. I'll be brief. So from a regulatory perspective, I think that there are a lot of things that the NRC could streamline, primarily administrative wise. But one of the key efforts that the Breakthrough Institute has been pushing for is the re-emphasis, an emphasis on the change in NRC mission, where NRC is not simply just, where the NRC is considering the negative impact of, not licensing nuclear reactors. And in that case, we're saying that if you don't license a nuclear reactor for a specific area and instead replace it with coal-fired coal power plant instead. And so I think there is a philosophy change that we are advocating for, at least in the regulatory space, for there to be a consideration of the negative impacts that are associated with not licensing those reactors and in a timely manner. In addition to that, there are some other small administrative changes that the NRC could make to be able to help to accelerate deployment of advanced reactors. For example, in their environmental review process, it's required that they have uncontested hearings for safety and environmental reviews. The idea there is that if the decision isn't contested, then we don't need to host a hearing. However, if the decision is contested, then that makes sense to be able to do that. But since the NRC is mandated by law, I think there needs to be some policy movement in the space to either remove the requirement for an uncontested hearing or defer that authority to the commission to decide that on a case-by-case basis.
I just want to comment, when I first started working in the US Senate in 1986, it was a much different framework. It was coming out of Chernobyl. There was a lot of anti-nuclear movement. Congress today is overwhelmingly supportive of deploying these technologies. And I thank folks like my friend Carol Browner, who has been a real leader in advocating that we need to address climate change, and we need to make sure that we use nuclear as part of that effort. Former Senator Kerry is saying the same thing, and we'll be repeating that at the COP coming up in Dubai. We've got folks like Sheldon Whitehouse, who has been second to nobody in pushing for addressing reduction in climate and carbon, who is a wholesale advocate of advanced reactor technology. So I think this sort of represents the change that we've seen in Washington. Now, policy-wise, I think we're needing some more assistance and support from Congress to get high-assay, low-enriched uranium produced so we can take advantage of some of these technologies. And I think Congress continuing to provide effective oversight of the NRC to make sure that it's doing its mission in an efficient and effective manner, and hopefully getting a regulatory framework for advanced reactors that's going to allow these to be deployed, yet at the same time making sure they meet their mission of protecting public health and the environment.
All right, well, thank you guys so much for these fascinating insights, and I appreciate to everyone who stayed a couple minutes over, as well as our panelists. And clearly, this is a very rich area with a lot of different thoughts and perspectives, where continued dialogue and exploration is really warranted. Thank you also to ELI for organizing and coordinating this. Sarah, I'll turn it over to you in case you have any last comments, but appreciate everyone.
Thank you so much, Tara, and thank you to all of our amazing speakers. This was a fantastic discussion. I really appreciate each and every one of you, Chris, Victor, Charlene, Jeffrey. This was a super complex topic, and we only really scratched the surface today. I'm sorry we didn't get to so many of all of your questions. As you can see, we're already over time. If there's more interest in programming on nuclear energy, definitely let us here at ELI know. We are happy to do more programming on this topic. Thank you to our wonderful audience for all of your questions. If you couldn't attend the full webinar today, ELI members will be able to watch the recording on the event webpage. It should be up within a few business days, probably early next week. We hope to see you at our future programming, which again, you can find at eli.org. And with that, thank you very much and have a fantastic afternoon, everybody.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone else.
Thank you.
Take care.